All right, so let me give you a little. Okay. Well, we have a full house. This is so exciting. All right. Thank you, everyone, for coming to our coffee mill. We are very lucky to have Pat Turner Ritchie here. We're a huge fan of you. Yes. And you are going to be talking about your great-great-grandmother, Eve Fulk Turner. And let's see. We do a lot of events here at Rocktown History. We do coffee mills, which is what you're at. It's kind of a casual, popcorn topic event with coffee, which everybody loves. Sponsored by Coffee Hound and Mount Crawford Creamery. And that's every second and fourth Tuesday starting at 9:30. We have coming up an exhibit opening, and that is going to be this month on the fourth Friday, which I think is October 24th, 5:30 to 7. So you can kind of get a sneak peek if you go down into the gallery today. But anyway, we'll have a big celebration for that at the end of the month. And then we have Janice Norton coming, and she's going to talk about her new book, and that is going to be November 14th. That's a Friday morning at 10:30. So anyway, our calendar is packed full. You can always go to rocktownhistory.org and look at events. Okay, I'm going to turn it over to you. Okay. We're going to go back in time now.
Thank you. Like Andrea said, my name is Eve Fulk Turner, and but most people call me Aunt Eve for a sign of respect for my age. But since I have 82 nieces and nephews, I'm pretty much used to the name now. And I think some of my nieces and nephews are in the crowd. Here's two nieces over here, and I've got a nephew somewhere. So if you know if you're my niece or nephew, go ahead and raise up your hand. These two? Okay, and a lot of cousins are here, and thanks for coming. Now, I'm dressed plain today because I'm a faithful member of the Dunkard Church, or the German Baptist Church, we called it my time. More likely you probably call it Brethren now. I dress plain, which ladies my age in this church do. And here's a picture of me and my husband, Uncle Dan Turner, in our later years. And if you could get a close look at this dress, I think it's the very dress that I'm wearing today because it looks like it has brown buttons on there. My sisters and brothers and I grew up on top of the Shenandoah Mountain in this log house. When we were young and growing up in the house, it had deer antlers all over the outside because my daddy and brother would shoot 20 to 40 deer every year, plus some bear, to keep food on the table for us. I was about 18 years old when the war between the states started, so I well remember that time. The young man had been practicing in the militia. You probably know that all men of a certain age had to be in the militia, and they get together regular to practice and target shoot and things like that. But Captain John Winfield out at Broadway started a group that he called the Brock's Gap Rifles. This was made up of young men like my brothers who wanted to get extra time in, and it was a social thing too. But as it looked more and more like we were headed toward war in this country, then they got more serious about practicing. This is a picture of my brother Adam, who was in the Brock's Gap Rifles. And I've got a better picture of him later on. You can see him a little bit better. Even before the war started in January of 1861, they got some newspaper, you'd call it publicity, and it said in the newspaper that one company of Brock's Gap should be called to service will make a reputation for themselves equal to the famous Morgan riflemen of Revolutionary memory. They are mostly stalwart mountaineers who are used to hitting a deer's eye by starlight. And woe to the man who encounter them. Well, when Virginia succeeded, and in April, the very next day, the men rushed to officially join the Brock's Gap Rifles. And the Fulk family was well represented. We had Adam Fulk, my brother George Fulk, our uncle, Captain George Fulk, and his son, my first cousin, John G. Fulk, and two of my daddy's first cousins. Also, some other Fulk men enlisted in other groups too. My daddy's first cousin, Christian Fulk Jr., and then our uncle, Adam Fulk, was in a different unit. So you can see we were well represented. Now we'll put this over here. When the war first started, the next day after they enlisted, they went to Harper's Ferry to join the other groups. While they were there, they hadn't been issued their long-range rifles yet. They just had taken their hunting guns. So they weren't very well equipped at all. A rumor came that the enemy was about to attack Harper's Ferry. So my brothers and family, being the brave men they just gathered up rocks and bricks and went out to meet the enemy. Lucky for them, the enemy didn't show up that day. But for a while, they were called the Brickbat Brigade. Now, I'll be talking about all the time during the war. In early 1862, Colonel John M. Bowdoin made a trip through Brock's Gap and Western Virginia, recruiting men for his new M. Bowdoin's Partisan Rangers. He stopped at Abel Dove's house for lunch, and while he and his officers were inside, the rest of the men waited outside. Well, the Doves fed him a good lunch, and the girls of the family were supposed to shoo the flies off the table with their newspaper. While they were doing that, they could hear Colonel M. Bowdoin's false teeth making clicking sounds while he ate, and they started giggling. And I bet their mother took the other end of that switch to them for insulting their famous guest. Well, even though he got sort of disrespected by the girls, he had a successful recruiting trip because 9 Dove men from the area were in his unit, along with other men from Burton. This little booklet, which I think you have out here for sale, tells all the names of the Rockingham County men who were in the Confederate service. And it says that 14 Doves, 21 Ritchies, 8 Turners, and 5 Fulks, and 24 Smiths were in the Confederate service. Most of those men, and many of those men, were either my cousins or neighbors, so you can get the idea of how lonely it was when all those men were away. Not only lonely, but we had a lot of hard work to do because we had to do all the outside work that we could, plus our regular inside work. This man, Lieutenant Blue, wrote about visiting my home on top of the Shenandoah Mountain. In 1862, he and another soldier had been over around Moorfield, and they had stolen cattle from, I don't know if it was the army or from just farmers. And they were bringing the cattle over to Harrisonburg to sell. They stopped at our mountain home because they hadn't eaten for 24 hours, and we fed them in their best mountaineer style with bear meat, butter, and milk, and cornbread. And they told us what a delicious meal that was. They really enjoyed that. During the meal, my daddy said, down around Harrisonburg, they must have been having a powerful thunderstorm because we've heard it thundering for 2 or 3 days down that way. Well, the soldiers on their way to our house had heard the artillery down around Harrisonburg, and it turned out that what we were hearing on top of the Shenandoah Mountain was actually the Battle of Cross Keys. Now, when you're a soldier, you can figure that one of 4 things, or maybe more than one of 4 things, is going to happen to you. You might get killed in battle, you might die of disease, you might get captured, or you might get wounded. And those things happened to a lot of the people that I knew. When the men first started going to war, they thought it was glorious. They had these beautiful handmade uniforms. The rifles had gray cloth that was manufactured around Naked Creek by the Funkhauser Company. And a gentleman had paid the $400 for their uniforms to be made. But we found out really soon that war wasn't all that glorious. The Brock's Gap Rifles were at Cape and Bridge in October 31st, 1862, and they were target shooting. They weren't fighting. My brother Adam went to check his target in a distance, and while he was at the target, Israel Zerk's gun got caught in the fringe of his jacket, or that's what the story was, and went off and hit my brother Adam. And he was killed. Our dad brought his body back to the Fulk Cemetery at Fulk's Run, where his remains rest today. And this is that little bit bigger picture of Adam. And after my talk, you're welcome to come up and look at that picture better. I'll put that up here so you can look at it. And then we weren't the only ones touched by violence. John Lance from Bergton died around Dayton here. And he wasn't killed either in battle. He died of typhoid fever in March of 1862. He was 22 years old and left a widow and one child. And if you know any Lances from Bergton or Criders, that'd be relation. Then my first cousin, John G. Fulk, had enlisted right away in the Rifles. He's survived 3 years of fighting and also survived a disease, dysentery, and that was bad. But in 1864, not too long before the war started, he was killed at Reams Station. Also in 1862, the same month that my brother Adam died, Christian Fulk Jr. died of the flu in the same month. Now, a lot of men were captured, and the most famous capture of all was when the Brock's Gap sharpshooters, that's a different group than the Rifles, but still had some of the same people in. They were camped out at Hudson Crossroads, that's in Shenandoah County. And they were camped out in the church, in one of the church buildings, so they had a nice dry place to sleep that night. Well, the enemy was only 12 miles away from there, and they found out that the sharpshooters were in the church. So they marched all night through the rain, and at daybreak they captured all 60 men, 70 horses, and all their baggage. And now their captain did say that it was a fine-looking group of men, so at least we had that to say about it. They were marched they couldn't ride their horses, but they were marched to Strasburg, and then I don't know if they marched all the way to Baltimore or if they got on a train or something. But anyway, they were imprisoned in Baltimore, and they made the front page of the Baltimore newspaper. And the paper that day has the names of all the men that were captured. There wasn't a prison of war camp ready for them yet, so they had to be held in the Baltimore jail for 2 weeks. And the newspapers had a couple articles about them and said that local people even brought them food and some clothing while they were in the jail. But after that 2 weeks, the prison camp over at Fort Delaware was ready, so they were put on steamships to go across the Delaware River to Peapatch Island where the prison was. And if you want to see some pictures of the prison, that poster over there afterward, you can see that. Now, lucky for our people, the prison camp was new and clean, and as far as I know, none of our men died of disease while they were there. They were only there for 3 months because then they got to go to Richmond to be exchanged. Again, it was early in the war, and they were lucky for that too because they exchanged Union soldiers for Confederate soldiers at that time. And those men made it back home, except one. Joe May got sick. I don't know if it was when he was a prisoner or on his way home, and he died just 20 miles away from Bergton in the home of the Hopkins family. Now, this is my brother-in-law, Isaac Turner, and he enlisted not in the Brock's Gap Rifles, but he was in another group. And he was captured in Maryland and then sent to Wheeling prison camp, and later on Camp Chase, which is close to Columbus, Ohio. I don't remember when he got returned, but he did come home safely, married a local girl, and raised a large family, and you probably know some of his descendants today. A lot of men were even younger than my brothers when they enlisted. James Souter was, I think, my second cousin from Bergton. He enlisted when he was 15 years old. He was captured at Romney and then was in prison camp at Camp Chase, and then he was transferred to Vicksburg, Mississippi to be exchanged. He went back in the Army even after that, but he died in Chattanooga, Tennessee in October of 1862. He was only 16 years and 4 months old. Now, if you know any Whitticks from around here, this would have been their uncle. Ulrich Whittick and his family came to the United States from Germany and Europe in 1838. His son John had been born in the United States, but some of the older children were born in Germany. John enlisted when he was 17 or 18 years old. He was also captured near Martinsburg, now West Virginia, was a prisoner at Camp Chase, and he was sent to Vicksburg to be exchanged. And he went back into the Army and deserted for a little while, but then went back into the Army again. In October 12th of 1863, he was in a battle over Jeffersonton, Virginia, and he received a mortal wound. It didn't kill him right away. He lingered 5 days, and a local family took him in and nursed him until the end. He was buried in a churchyard over there, but after a couple months, his dad, Ulrich Whittick, took the wagon over and brought his remains back, and they had a funeral for him, and he's buried in the Lutheran Cemetery at Bergton. As far as I know, George Lance was the last person from Bergton to be killed during the war. He had been sick during the war because disease was prevalent among a lot of soldiers. But he was killed in 1864 in the Third Battle of Winchester, and he left a wife and young child. If any of you are any of y'all from Fulk's Run, if you're about my age, his grandchildren were Rachel and Bonnie Lance, who lived at Fulk's Run. Now, some men got diseases during the war, but recovered, but it still left them weak or somewhat disabled. Not only diseases, but wounds too. This is Lorenzo Frederick Smith. He's the father of many of the Smiths that you might know from the Bergton area. He fought almost the whole time, and but the exposure to the elements like cold, sleeping out in the cold and not good food and all that left his lungs damaged. He died at home at age 42, leaving a wife and 8 children under the age of 16. Silas May was, I think he was also captured too, but his injury was he was shot through the thigh and the ball exited his hip joint. And he was disabled from that, although he was a farmer after the war. Now, I'm not sure which leg it was, but the way he's favoring that left leg makes me think that maybe his left leg was the one that was injured. And then Reuben Dove had quite a history in the Army. He was from Bergton, of course, since he was a Dove. He was injured in the knee when a horse fell on him one time, and he was captured not once but twice. And he was in not one prison camp, but he was in 4 different prison camps. He was at Fort Delaware with the others, then Old Capitol Prison, Point Lookout, and Elmira, New York, which they say was really a bad prison camp. And he also had smallpox, but he recovered from smallpox. And he also came home and married a local girl and had a large family. And some of his people, I think, have been employed by the city of Harrisonburg. You probably know their names if I could remember who it was.
It's all right.
You know, at my age, it's hard to remember all of this.
You're doing well.
And then Israel Kaplinger from Craters, since he was a Kaplinger, he got a saber wound in his right shoulder, and he also survived pneumonia and typhoid fever. And poor old Wash May, I don't have a picture of him, but in a battle he was run over by the horses of his own cavalry. And then he was also wounded in his hand when he tried to catch a Union horse. But he made it home and lived a long life. Now, some men didn't want to go to war. Not everybody thought it was glorious. And a lot of people, like people in my Brethren Church and Mennonite Church, didn't believe in war no matter what. Elder John Klein from Broadway, this isn't a picture of him, but it's a painting of what he might have looked like. He was instrumental in talking to the Virginia government to get exemptions for Brethren and Mennonites and others who didn't believe in war, religious exemptions you'd call it. That worked for a while, but it wasn't without cost, because if you got an exemption you had to pay $500 per person. And that might not sound like much to you today, but in my time that was about 2 or 3 years of salary. Sometimes men didn't want to go to war because they had big family obligations. My brother-in-law, Josiah Turner, was one of these. And this is your people right here. And Mike Rhodes, wherever Mike is, Mike sees that. Mike's a descendant of Josiah. Josiah had big family obligations. He was the oldest son in the family who was still at home. He had a widowed mother, a widowed aunt who lived with him. He had a wife and 3 small children. He had 4 younger sisters and 3 younger brothers and some nieces and nephews that he had to support. And he was the only man on the farm. So John Klein, Elder Klein, even wrote to the governor trying to get him an exemption because of all this obligation that he had. But he couldn't get exemption. So Josiah had to hide out whenever the army recruiters were in the area. One time he was up on the mountain at our house with the family, and the recruiters found him. And he said, "Okay, I'll go with you this time. I'll go get my horse and get my things." So he went outside and the soldiers went in and started eating, and because they were always hungry. So while they were eating, Josiah's little son Adam came in crying. And the soldiers thought, uh-oh, he's trying to get away. So they ran outside, and sure enough, Josiah was headed for the woods and the mountain. Well, they pulled their guns, and they were going to shoot him, because if you didn't go in the army, you were a deserter and you could be shot. So luckily for Josiah, I was coming from the spring with one of my sisters. So I got on one side of him, and my sister got on the other side of him, and we all ran to the woods, and he got away because they weren't going to shoot us. As far as I know, they never did get him, although they tried at least another time. I think they even roughed up my sister, his wife, trying to get her to tell him where he was. Then there were, in addition to the religious exemptions, there were other exemptions to keep you out of the army. Josiah Souter was a blacksmith at Bergton, and he was exempt. Even though he was draft age, he was around 40, but he could still be drafted. He was exempt. That was his son, James, that died. So he did support that way. And then Stephen Foley at Fulk's Run was a blacksmith, and this is some of, where's Jane? Some of her uncles, and for the rest of you too. Stephen, somebody asked one of his granddaughters one time, well, which side did he shoe horses for? And whichever side came in the shop first, of course. You could also get an exemption if you were a miller, blacksmith, and shoemaker, because those are efforts that the armies needed. Some men soldiered for a while and then went home. Stonewall Jackson, was commander of a lot of our people, and at first it was pretty lenient. If you needed to go home and help plow the field or bring in the harvest, they sort of looked the other way. But after a while, Stonewall got really hard about that, and even had 3 deserters shot. There's stories about that up there if you want to read that. William Dove at Bergton, let's see, where's Dolores? Oh yeah, okay. Okay, this is the house that she grew up in, was his house during the Civil War. And he fought for a while and then came home, and the army recruit without leave, without permission. So the recruiters found out where he was and rode their horses right up on the porch of her house and demanded he come out and come back with them to the army. Well, he was going out the back door. His wife tried to delay the soldiers as long as she could, and one of them was even her cousin, but they pretended not to know one another. He got away that night and stayed away out of the army the rest of the time. His wife had to take food to him at night, though, so that she didn't give away where he was hiding. And then this is my husband's cousin, George W. Turner. He lived at Fulk's Run. He was in the Brock's Gap sharpshooters. He was captured at Fort Delaware, paroled, and came back. And he got back in the Army, though, and even fought at Gettysburg. Well, after Gettysburg sometime, he found out that his sister was dying, and he did get a permission to go home to be with her in her final days. Well, her lingering lasted longer than his furlough, so he took it on himself to stay home until her very end. The night before her funeral, they found him. The soldiers were up on the porch and demanded that he go with them. So while they were on the porch, he crawled out the window over the body of his dead sister, out the window, and ran to a hollow pine tree that he had close by. And even though they went up and down the road on their horses, they couldn't find him. And he stayed out of the war the rest of the time, too. But those Army men were pretty persuasive sometime. Ahab Dove had been in the Army. He was captured at Fort Delaware and so on, but he came back and was going to farm because he had younger brothers and sisters and a widowed mother also. Well, one day he was out plowing the field, and the soldiers came up on their horses, surrounded him, pulled out their guns and said, "Ahab, wouldn't you like to re-enlist?" And he did. Now, you know that Virginia was a border state, Rockingham County is a border county. Brock's Gap was on the border between Hardy County, what became West Virginia, and Rockingham County. So we had a lot of cases of brother against brother, cousin against cousin. This is Abel Dove. Remember Colonel Imboden was at his house eating? Well, this was him. He had a brother named Absalom Dove who lived over on Flat Top Mountain in Hardy County, which is actually just a couple miles away from Bergton. He was for the Union, and his son and son-in-law were in the Union Army. Well, Abel's sons were in the Confederate Army. The hard feelings lasted between those two brothers so long that even after the war, they would not even admit that they were brothers. Now, some men, again, soldiered for a while and then came home. So let's get back to my brother George. When he first was in, Captain Winfield said that he was the bravest man in the whole unit. And he just went out to meet the enemy just without a thought. George got sick sometime during his service, though, about 1862 or 1863. And he came home on top of the Shenandoah Mountain to recover. After a while, the soldiers came to get him and said, "You've been sick long enough, come on." But he was still too weak to go. They took his horse and said, "All right, as soon as you're better, you come back." "Okay, I will." But when he got better, he went west to Indiana, where our uncle lived, another case of brother against brother. And he got a job with a family out there. Well, that man was drafted, and he didn't want to fight. So George was a substitute for him. He got paid $500 to be a substitute. So now he's back in the war, but this time for the Union side. Those Indiana troops went all the way to North Carolina at Fort Fisher, and they attacked Fort Fisher, which was the last fort on the eastern coast where we could get supplies through, from Europe and other places. So the fort had been captured. The Union soldiers, like my brother George, were inside the fort. They had taken about 1,000 prisoners, and George and about 100 other men were just camped out for the night in the fort. Well, they found this nice grassy hill for their beds. They thought that'd be a good place. They didn't know they were on top of the powder magazine. During the night, 2 drunken sailors went in there with lighted torches and blew up the powder magazine. 104 men, including my brother, were blown to bits. And I know you can't see it from here, but this is a picture taken inside that fort the day that my brother was killed that night. Okay. So that's what it would have looked like inside the fort. I'll put that over here if you want to look at that. Now again, we women were having to do the outside work, bringing in the firewood, cutting down trees, chopping the firewood and all that sort of thing, planting the crops, whatever we could, tending our gardens. But we also had a lot of worry. What was happening to our men while they were gone? Were they captured? Were they going to be killed? Here's an example of that for sure. Mary Ann Halterman lived in Hardy County, but Matthias area, and they were pretty much Southern sympathizers over that way. Mary Ann's husband, 3 brothers and 4 brothers-in-law were all in the Confederate Army in one unit or another. One brother-in-law died during the war. One brother-in-law was captured and was a POW, and then one brother survived the war but died of disease shortly afterward. And then Eveline Aubrey from Fulk's Run had married, I've got her. She married George Aubrey from Pendleton County. And she moved over to Pendleton County. Well, when the war started, he enlisted in the Union Army and became a captain. But he was captured sometime and was sent to Libby Prison, where he died in 1862. That same year, her mother died of stroke. Her brother died in the Confederate service, and her only son died of diphtheria. So it was bad times. We also had to worry about soldiers coming through. They were always hungry, so if we heard soldiers were in the area, we would hide as much of our food as we could, and even the people who had stores would hide their store stock. Some of my cousins over at Matthias had a little store, and they laughed that after the war there was one thing that they had hid so good that they never could find that box of combs. And if the dogs started barking at night or during the day, then we figured strangers or probably soldiers were coming, so we took pains to stay safe. Then the soldiers destroyed property. You remember we had rail fences in those days, and a lot of times the soldiers would just grab the rails off our fence to build fires. Couldn't really blame them, they were tired, but still that cost a lot of money later, and it was hardship on us. And then Josiah Souter, that I showed you the picture of, he lost a whole flax crop because the soldiers cut down the flax and used it for bedding, so they had a little bit softer bed when they were camping out that night. Also, if you had horses still at home, if you heard soldiers were in the area, you'd hide your horses. Josiah had a place on the ridge that he called the High Hot, and whenever soldiers were in the area, he'd send his horses up there to hide out. And your families probably had hiding places too. Now, after the war, pardon me, this nose is running here. After the war, things weren't too bad for us on top of the mountain because we still had deer and bear that we could put, oh, thank you, dear. Thank you. We still had deer and bear that we could put food on the table. But out here, especially around Dayton and Bridgewater, you all really had it bad because Sheridan had come through and burned all the mills and barns and driven off your livestock. But thankfully, we were able to escape some of that. And I didn't talk about money, but toward the end of the war, even the Confederate government did not want you to pay your taxes with their money. They wanted you to pay taxes with bacon and corn and food that they could eat and supply the soldiers with. Well, that's the end of my stories for during the war, and I've got some other stories, but we'll save that for another time. I want to thank you for your attention today and coming out, and I have souvenirs for you. It's $1,000 Confederate. And I promise it'll buy just as much today as it did June of 1865.